I'll be moving on to talk about the Roman state, ancient Rome, of course, the rise of the Romans, which, of course, became the so called mighty Roman Empire, one of the largest empires in antiquity, ancient times that occurred. So I'll be kind of talking about the background of Rome today and the Republic, I guess, mostly today and I think on Wednesday. Now, the Roman culture, like I said in the video, was really long, more than 1,000 years. You want to include the Byzantine Empire, you're looking at almost 2,000 years of history. And Roman civilization started in Italy. That's where Rome was founded. On the Tiber River today. Of course, over time, it grew into this large size state, like I said, that'll eventually become the Roman Empire. I think the largest empire before the Middle Ages that you have later. You have other empires that are much larger than the Roman Empire, like the Mongol Empire, I think the Ottoman Empire, and the British Empire, and a few other, Russian Empire, and others that, of course, come later as a whole. But I do have a map kind of showing you the Roman Empire right here. And you can see the empire stretched basically from Spain, France, and I guess Britain, North Africa. You can see it goes all the way into the Eastern Mediterranean, Black Seas. You can see it stretched all the way to the Red Sea, and even at one point reaching Mesopotamia, maybe even the Caspian Sea at one point. And the Roman civilization itself, the empire itself, peaked at something like 2 million square miles in size. I think pretty much the largest empire so far in history. Population maybe exceeding 50 million at one point. And you can see, of course, it controlled at one point 3 continents, most of Europe, part of North Africa. You can see it also included part of Southwestern Asia as well. So definitely maybe a little bigger than the Persian and also empires of Alexander the Great that had just been right before that previously. Well, let me talk about a little bit about the background of course, the city of Rome, which you're kind of viewing right here. And Rome itself began around basically the Tiber River, which is in kind of like central Italy. I think in that map it looks like it's on the coast, but it's not. And Rome itself was founded around the 8th century BC, kind of like the same time of when the Greeks were founded. And was founded around 7 hills, which the most famous hill, of course, you may have heard of is the Palatine Hill, but they do have other hills that are, of course, well known. Aventine Hill, Caelian Hill, Esquiline, Capitoline, Viminal Hill, Quirinal Hill as well. You can see right there, you can see the Palatine's kind of like in the middle with the Tiber River, of course, to the west over here. Most of the old area of Rome, like around the Servian Wall, was where ancient Rome originally was. And you can see on the left, that's kind of like the Palatine Hill, where some of the early palaces were of some of the emperors of Rome from the Forum floor, which you can see there. So, yeah, that's of course the legend. Of course, the belief about Rome was that it was founded around the year 753 BC, which is supposedly the Romans used to count back to it in going back to the 8th century. But 753 BC is the traditional date of when Rome was founded, kind of like the Greek one, which was 776 BC. So kind of close around the same time period of when both those kind of cultures kind of come about. Now, there's some legends, of course, about the early founding of Rome, which you may have heard about, which is well known. That's, of course, about the fact that Rome was supposedly founded by these twins that were named Romulus and Remus. And they were believed to be demigods, supposedly descended from the god Mars. There's a story where supposedly an ancient king of Italy named King Numitor, who was supposedly a mythological ruler of a city called Alba Longa. And supposedly he had this daughter named Rhea Silvia that was raped by the god Mars. And so the offspring was these two twins, of course, Romulus and Remus. And so this might be, of course, mythology, because a lot of the early history of the Romans is based on a lot of mythology. You don't really know if it's really true or not. They do think there was a King Romulus, first king of the Romans, but they're not really sure if he was, all these mythologies are really true about that. But a lot of the Romans believe that King Numitor was a descendant of Aeneas in the famous epic by the Roman poet Virgil, who wrote the Aeneid. So a lot of Romans actually believe these kind of stories about Rome, and so that they say that's where the the name of Rome originated from, is of course from Romulus, who later was one of the first kings. Supposedly there was a deal where Romulus and Remus quarreled about the building of Rome later, and Romulus killed Remus, and so. And of course, what's the deal with the she-wolf? They often call that the so-called Capitoline wolf. And there was a story where King Numitor had this brother named Emilius that wanted to steal the throne from him. And so he took the two boys and tried to drown them. So that basically when he imprisoned, I guess, King Numitor, he could seize the throne and not have to worry about them trying to take over. And there was a miracle where they survived being drowned, and they were saved by the she-wolf, where they suckled on her teats. And so you often see the Capitoline wolf, sometimes with the two boys and then sometimes without them. But it's a famous symbol of Rome that's well known. That and the eagle, of course, as well. Now I'll talk about the fasci, of course, another famous symbol that the Romans, of course, are well known for. Let me first talk about some of the different writers that wrote about early Roman history. Now, the one on the far left there you can see is Livy, or I think originally called Titus Livius, but in the West they call him Livy for short. Livy was a Roman historian living about 2,000 years ago. He wrote a series of books that were originally called Ab Urbe Condite Libre, which means books from the founding of the city, like the city of Rome. They now call it the History of Rome, and it's a collection of like 142 books that chronicalizes like Roman history from really the founding of Rome, going back to Romulus and Remus up to the time of Julius Caesar, around the 1st century BC. So it covers about 8 centuries in history. Only about 1/4 of the actual books that he wrote are still around, which is like especially the first 5 books, which gives a lot of history of the early Roman monarchy and also the Republic. And so he gives us a lot of history, like some of the early kings and some of the early people that reigned over the Republic in general. Aisha is also joining us in StreamYard, by the way. But so yeah, that's of course Livy, who's kind of well known. He also writes later about Hannibal, the Second Punic War, during the so-called Punic Wars, where Rome fought Carthage as well. In the middle, you've got Plutarch, who's a famous Greek writer that we've kind of talked about off and on. Plutarch wrote a series of biographies called Parallel Lives, where he compared Greek and Roman nobility to each other. He's got a lot of biographical information on famous Romans. Those are just some examples right there, but he gives us a history of Romulus, Sulla, Gaius Marius, Gnaeus Pompey, Mark Antony, Julius Caesar. So he's very, very important in dealing with like a lot of the biographical information about important events, that happened in the Roman world, especially after the Republic. And then on the far right, you've got the Roman poet Virgil, who about 2,000 years ago wrote the Roman epic called the Aeneid, which kind of like is an extension of the Trojan War epic. Homer started a long time ago. He talks about the sack of Troy and all that, and how Aeneas survived Camillo's also joining us too this morning and this afternoon. And he talks about the adventures of Aeneas, who was a Trojan hero and cousin of King Priam of the Trojans. And Aeneas is kind of an important figure in Roman history because some Romans believe that a lot of their early descendants, especially those of the nobility, were descended from Aeneas, because Aeneas later migrated to Italy, where he settled, like helped settle early cities that became, they think, related to the Romans later. So the story is that Romulus and Remus were supposedly descendants of Aeneas, but they're not sure about that. That's just what the Romans believed a long time ago. But a lot of the nobility believed that, like Julius Caesar, as an example, thought he was descended from Aeneas and things like that. The Romans actually are a mix of people. Like if you study about the Romans, they're kind of a mix of like different European ethnic groups that were there going back to like the Bronze Age. Latin peoples, mostly in central Italy. The Etruscans, like they talked about in northern Italy, area called Tuscany today, or the Romans called it Etruria. So the other name they called it where the word Etruscan comes from. And then the Greeks in the south, who were in like Naples, Sicily, were also important. I think they were the most influential in the end, was the Greeks. The Greeks often called southern Greece, they called it Magna Graecia or Great Greece because of their influence, which they got a lot of things from the Greeks, like Greek language, Greek culture, religion, architecture, philosophy, you name it, history or whatever. It influenced, of course, the Greeks, the Romans at one point. So they're Hellenized, the Romans, I guess, over time. Now I'm going to get to, of course, today and talk about a little history about the Roman state overall. Of course, they say one of the first things that Romulus had to do was he had to go out and populate Rome, because Rome didn't have any women. And so he went to various tribes like the Sabine tribes and other tribes and either took women or brought women with them to help settle it. And so that was one of the first things they had to do was, get more people and populate it. And over time, they start to kind of absorb all the different peoples and cultures that are Italy at that time during the Iron Age. There's kind of some pictures, of course, of the different Roman kings that ruled over the Roman monarchy or regal period, as they sometimes called it as well. You can see the kings reigned from 753 to 509. Roman kingdom, I think, is another term they use as well for it. Of course, you see Romulus was the first king. He reigned from about 753 to 716. You can see the other kings they had too: Numa Pompilius, Tullus Hostilius, Ancus Marcius, Tarquin the Elder, Servius Tullius, and Tarquin the Proud as well. Most of them, by the way, a lot of the kings, if you study about most of them later were a combination of either Sabine or Etruscan. I know the last three of them were in power from 616 to 510 were the Tarquin family, those ones you see on the bottom. And Etruscans had a major influence, of course, on the Romans. That's where they get the ideas of like gladiatorial events and things like that. I think aqueducts and things like that, I think originally came from Etruscans in general. Some of their even Latin evolved from them as well. So Romans owe a lot of their influence to other cultures that they kind of absorbed over time. If you study about the Roman kings, they had what they call imperium. Imperium was this type of absolute power, even though they were elected to power. They have pretty much the final say on, I guess, policies in general. They do have a Roman Senate, which is more like an assembly or council of elders that advise the king, and over time it becomes like a Roman type assembly that's well known. But I'll get to it later. Romans call their assemblies a council or a comitia, which committee comes from, of course, today. Now, one of the most famous things that the Romans are famous for is the symbol, the so-called fasci symbol, which has been around, for years. This, of course, becomes a major symbol of, Roman power. It has a lot to do with, the fact that these kings, or later the magistrates that run Rome, having power over others, the power to command. And the term fasci is a term, supposedly in Latin, that means bundle. Some people say bundle of rods, but it's more like bundle. And it symbolized the magistrates' powers, like especially when the Roman consuls and other magistrates, rule over Rome. It shows how they have power over others, like the authority to command, or the authority to have power. And it usually includes a bundle of rods that are bound together with an axe coming out of it. And later on in modern times, as you know, you study about the early 20th century, Italian fascists like Benito Mussolini borrowed it, and of course developed the so-called fascist movement, or fascism movement, in Italy. And it was often a symbol of fascism in the 20th century, of course, in modern Europe, which is much, much later, of course, when that is. Other symbols I talked about too. The Capitoline wolf, of course, was another symbol of Rome, which went back to the legendary scene of the founding of Rome, Romulus and Remus being saved by a wolf. And then the eagle is another symbol which the Romans incorporated into their empire. It's a symbol that they believe was developed by the famous politician and general Gaius Marius. That's a little later when that is, but he would adopt that. And the symbol was a symbol of a lot of things. It represented power, strength, things like that, but also fortune and luck. It represented too, but also, at least the Romans, it represented divine intervention or divinity, which represented God, especially Jupiter, which of course the Romans saw that God as, of course, being like, the equivalent of Zeus, basically. And of course other empires, incorporate, states. They incorporate the eagle. Even the United States has an eagle, but a lot of states have used the eagle as a symbol. But it's often been a symbol of empires, especially in Europe, with a double-headed eagle, of course, which is the most famous. Now, like I said, the Roman state, it would, of course, originally it was a monarchy, for a bunch of years, over 2 centuries at that point. But they had this incident happen in like around 510 BC that totally changed things, which that was the rape of Lucretia, which they think helped precipitate the overthrow of the monarchy. That was a case where there was a Roman Latin woman named Lucretia that was raped by one of the king's sons. His name was, it's on the bottom there, his name was Sextus Tarquinius, was his name. And he raped this woman at knife point, and she was so embarrassed about it that she killed herself. She committed suicide. And they think that that particular incident was a watershed moment in Roman history. And so the Romans decided, like I said, to establish a republic, to overthrow and get rid of the monarchy at that point. And so the kings were expelled. And the Romans said later that they would have no more kings, after that. Well, with her dead, Lucretia, what happened was she had her relatives, which were her uncle and her husband, they would go on to found the Roman Republic, which they think founded probably around 509 BC, roughly. Lucius Junius Brutus and Lucius Tarquinius Collatinus, those two, of course, were considered the first co-rulers and also co-consuls that would run the Roman state. Because, if you know about that, after that, the Romans got rid of kings and they replaced them with consuls, like chief magistrates. So that was one of the things that first happened, that's kind of important, with the founding of the Roman state, with that. And so after that, Rome, they start to call it, different names, which the common name that they usually refer to the Roman state is SPQR, or Senatus populus Romanus. And so the Roman state became this type of representative democracy, which was, they think, heavily influenced by, Greek influences, pretty much. And this name, of course, was often used to describe the Roman government, not just the republic that would come, now at this point, but also the Roman Empire that would follow, of course, later. So it stands for the Senate and the Roman people in Latin. I know it was like a representative democracy, which, the United States today is an example of a type of country which is, based on a Republican type government overall. But in a sense, it was almost like an oligarchy because of the fact that a lot of the upper classes had most of the power, especially the patricians, I'll talk about later. So they had a lot of power and they owned a lot of land. And so a lot of the governmental aspects, like the organs of the government, the land, the military, even the Roman religion, a lot of it was heavily controlled by the upper classes. By the way, the term republic or the term republican, which is still used today, originated from Latin. It does come from two words, res publica, which means public affairs, or some people say commonwealth, usually one word, but kind of separated on purpose there to show you the difference. But people's wealth, dealing with the public in general, is what I guess they're talking about with that particular term. Now, if you study about SPQR, or the different social class, that's one thing about Rome. Rome had different social classes that they had in Rome. The two main ones were the patricians, and then you had what they call the plebeians. What's the difference? Well, the patricians were the aristocrats or nobility that descended back to the founding of Rome. Even some of the patricians claimed that they were descended from Aeneas, who had come into Italy, Romulus, I guess, as well. In fact, the word patrician evolved from the Roman Latin word father, so the word pater, father, and so basically they see themselves as the fathers of Rome, more or less. Plebeians, or plebes as they're called for short quite often, were just the common people. These would be like non-nobility, etc., and they made up a majority of the Roman population. They do have some other social classes that were also part of Rome. They do have a class called the equites, which the knightly class or equestrian class that came out of the cavalry. They're kind of like this upper middle class that's between the patricians and the plebes. So they're around as well. I think they kind of evolved into some kind of business or merchant type social class. They had women are also can be upper class too, but they were never considered equal to men in Roman society. In fact, fathers can pretty much, do whatever they want with their daughter. They can practically force her to divorce her husband. That's how powerful the father is. The father was often seen as the head of the family, paterfamilia, you may have heard about. And so men had a lot of power, over their families. Of course, then you've got slaves. If you know about the Roman state, Republic, and Empire later, good majority of the population was slave. It varies on how many. I'd say got 1/3 to 1/4, depending on the time period. But that was also often gotten from, through warfare. All the people that they captured or whatever in war became POWs. And so a lot of things in the Roman world, like buildings, like the Colosseum behind me, I showed you before, was pretty much built by slaves. Now, the Roman government, if you know about it, had multiple assemblies. They had like 4 or 5 that they had. And Roman assembly was called a consul, which is kind of like the same name that the Greeks called it. Greeks called it consula bulle, if you know about that. But the actual Latin word is actually comitia. You see there, that's the Latin word for a consul or an assembly. It's also where the origin of the word committee comes from today. If you're on a committee or whatever, comes from, of course, that Latin word right there. But those are the different assemblies that the Romans had. Of course, the most famous one you've heard of course, is the Roman Senate. The Roman Senate was primarily controlled by the patricians or upper classes. And it was kind of a deliberating body, which might have 300 members or more in it. And so they often advised a lot of the magistrates in running the state. They dealt with foreign policy. They controlled a lot of the money as well. They didn't really pass laws that much and all that. They had the plebeian council, which was like an assembly later added around the 5th century BC, which was an assembly for a lot of the plebes, for like the lower classes, for them. I'll get to like so-called the tribune magistrate, or plebeian tribune they have, which was a magistrate that was associated with the plebeian consul. Tribal consul for the different tribes, because Romans were like the Greeks. They separated themselves in the tribes as well. And they also, the one that got there on the last one there, the centuriate consul was another consul, which was famous as well, which was one for the military that they had. Now, the Romans also had magistrates. That's one thing, kind of like the Greeks. Greeks had like archons and things like that that ran the state that we talked about before, which the word archon means leader or maybe ruler. But they have magistrates that run the state. And most of them are either elected or appointed to office. You can see at the top here that the highest magistrate was a Roman consul. The consul, of course, was the chief magistrate. There's 2 of them elected for one annual term, like 1-year terms overall. You can see they managed the army and the affairs of government. It's kind of close, like almost like a president, more or less, executive type office. And they had veto power, where they could veto each other or veto magistrates that are below them as well. Consuls could become dictators in case of emergencies. They could also become a censor, which I'll explain later about the censors. A praetor is a type of judicial figure that dealt with Roman law. So they were involved in basically the Roman court systems and dealing with Roman laws in general. So they're kind of important as well. They're under the consul. They could also become governors of provinces. You can see they could also head up legions like a Roman consul could. Dele, should they say it? Dele, they were basically these government officials that ran like the public buildings, like infrastructure. They dealt with food supply. They ran a lot of the public games. The Dele was the one that maintained the temples, and he put on like the Circus Maximus, the Colosseum, and things like that that were done. Looks like Fernando's joining us also as well. Quaestors, or a quaestor right here, they manage financial affairs of the actual government, like the treasury. They dealt with money, taxation, things like that. And you can see how many there were of each one. Tribune was a plebeian council member. He was a representative of the plebes, and he was often associated with the plebeian consul or plebeian assembly, which is called different names. I think some people call it the People's Assembly or People's Council as well. Then you got ordinary people on the bottom, of course. A lot of people are farmers. Then you got your slaves, of course, on the bottom. So it's kind of showing the hierarchy of all the different peoples that were there. Oh, by the way, the censor, I think that was one thing I forgot to talk about. The censor basically ran the census, which was done every 5 years. They have a head count where they count the population for tax purposes to see who's a citizen and all that. And a censor, there was only 2 of them that they elected every 5 years. So it's a very prestigious position. They also dealt with censorship as well. Censors, I believe, were involved in also building like infrastructure. Like they built buildings, they built roads, and things like that. So the censor was also a pretty important elected position as well. So Rome had a lot of positions that were elected. I think even if you read about the so-called, I think they've got the Pontifex Maximus, which is the high priest. That was an elected position as well, believe it or not. So a lot of their positions were elected. They did have this thing called the cursus honorum that they had under the Republic that was kind of famous. And it was basically a course where you would take politically to go from, like, I guess, the lower magistrates to an upper one. And so you would start on the bottom. You would start with like military service first, and you'd work your way up. Quaestor, I guess, a daily praetor, and then you eventually get elected to Roman consul. And so the Romans did this for people to get experience, but also to try, I guess, to stamp out any kind of, tyranny or whatever. Now, one thing I did want to talk about with the plebes did have this thing where over time they got, political rights in Rome. I'll kind of talk about the 12 tables a little bit later. But the plebes went through this period called the conflict of the orders, or also called the struggle of the orders, where they fought for political power with the patricians. It kind of occurred between the 5th and the 3rd centuries BC, because when Rome became a republic, the patricians had most of the power, like I said. And so what happened to the plebes, to try to get more rights, what they did was, starting in 494, they went on strike, so-called plebe strike, that's sometimes nicknamed. They refused to do their work. They refused to deal with, like, the patricians. They also refused to serve in the armies, like in the Roman armies. And so all these things, they think, helped to lead to more political power. And so the patricians had to basically, allow them more rights. Otherwise, it would create instability within Roman society. And so in 471, patricians allowed the plebes to create their own assembly. Around 471, they think it's when it was. And so that became known as the plebe council, or also called the People's Assembly. It's called all kinds of names that people called it. But basically the common people's, assembly that they had, where they could pass laws, which I think are called plebiscites. So they could create their own laws, protect plebes and things like that. Tribune was like a plebeian magistrate that was associated with the plebes and the plebe council. They were involved in protecting the rights of plebes and their property. Now, I think the plebe magistrate had veto power, just like the actual Roman consuls did. I think there were like 10 of them, though. There were plebe magistrates, and they were pretty powerful up to at least close to the 1st, 2nd century BC. They also ended segregation between the two classes, and so plebes and patricians even intermarry over time. They also got their own laws. Eventually, what happened, the political struggle led to the Romans creating the so-called Roman Constitution of the Republic, which was later called the Law of the 12 Tables, or just the 12 Tables for short, which came out around 450 BC. And the 12 Tables was a set of codified laws that were written on 12 tablets. That's why it's called that. It really means 12 tablets, basically in Latin. And jurists hammered this out, and it became like a civil law code system, which was also having a criminal code in it as well. And it broke up the monopoly that the patricians had, and helped to settle disputes between both the plebes and the patricians, and protect their rights. It also decided, who was a free citizen of Rome and who was not as well. So it created like the first real civil, code that the Romans would have, and that became the basis of the Roman Constitution, law codes, court systems, and things like that later that they will have. So 12 Tables was really important, of course, and influenced a lot of Roman laws. All right. Now, another thing I did want to talk about, too, before I move on, I want to talk about as well the Roman Forum. That's something else that the Romans, of course, are known for. And in Rome, they had this town square, or if you want to call it a public square, that they now call the Roman Forum today. It's their civic center. That's where, the Romans had their collection of temples, markets, baths, entertainment, a Colosseum nearby, and things like that. You can see from that image right here that it's located close to where the Palatine Hill is. And the forum was not built in a day. Of course, the Roman Forum was built over many centuries, and of course, built by many different rulers of Rome, whether it be republican or imperial, emperors, whatever later that they have. And it's located actually between the Palatine and Capitoline Hill. That's located kind of a small valley that's there. Most of the actual, site itself of the forum is mostly in ruins today, which mostly evolved from all the different conflicts and wars that have hit Rome, going back to, I guess, ancient times. But it is, of course, a major tourist attraction. I know before the pandemic, hit, they think somewhere between 4 and 5 million tourists would annually visit, Rome and, of course, the Forum itself. So it's one of the central aspects of the old ancient city of Rome. You can see like the Roman Colosseum, in the background and things like that. So things are kind of within walking distance, from each other. And of course, the old saying about Rome is, when in Rome, do the things that Romans do. And maybe all the roads do lead to Rome in general. But like I said, Rome was not built, in a day. It was built over many centuries. Now, one of the things, of course, I will be moving on today to talk about, I will be, of course, I have a few minutes today to kind of discuss about the famous Punic Wars, of course, that followed, of course, during the early Republic, which really the Punic Wars is one of the first of a series of wars that really expand the Roman Republic and, of course, become more of an empire. In between the 3rd and 4th centuries, Rome began to take over the whole entire Italian peninsula. They conquered the northern part first, where I guess the Etruscans were. And in the southern part was conquered by the beginning of the 3rd century BC. There was a deal where Rome fought this king named King Pyrrhus, who came over from where Albania is. It's like the kingdom of Epirus, close to Macedonia. The Romans fought the so-called Pyrrhic War, you may have heard about, where King Pyrrhus brought over elephants and infantry, mostly mercenaries. And the Romans fought a pitched battle where they eventually defeated his forces, even though it was a bloody conflict. And King Pyrrhus kept saying that if he wins one more battle, he'll be utterly ruined, was his famous quote. And they always talk about Pyrrhic victories that, of course, came out of that term from that particular conflict. And all that. But from there, the Romans were able to secure the southern part of Italy and began to take over Sicily eventually. It's one of the things that the Romans will do. But in the meanwhile, of course, the Romans will have to fight a very bloody war against the Carthaginian Empire, what we call Carthage, the so-called Punic Wars, which occur between the 3rd and the 2nd centuries BC. Looks like Dacian is also joining us this morning. So it's afternoon. So I hope you're having a good afternoon there. Not sure what part of the day it is. But anyway, talk a little bit about the Carthaginian Empire. Do you have maps showing you what the Carthaginian Empire looked like originally in ancient times? Carthage was actually a larger empire than the Roman state. You go back to the 3rd century. And the Carthaginians were actually a multi-ethnic empire, mostly a trading empire, famous for its merchant trade throughout the Mediterranean Sea. And anyway, they believed that Carthage was founded in the 9th century by the Phoenicians. I think I talked about this before, how the Phoenicians had come into North Africa. And it was a famous queen, by the way, that was known as Queen Dido. And she supposedly bought some of the first land that was there in North Africa. And so Carthage was actually, the city of Carthage, which basically became their capital, was founded where the modern city of Tunis is, in Tunisia, just kind of sandwiched between, by the way, Libya and Algeria on the North African coast. It's not that far from where Sicily is. You can see it right next to Sicily. And they think that the population of the empire, at least in the 3rd century, peaked about 3 to 4 million in size. Carthage itself may have peaked at maybe a population of, I want to say, 500,000, which actually was larger than the Rome itself, at least at the time. So they think Carthage, their empire, was actually better than the Romans had. Now, the Carthaginians, I think the Roman armies were better. The Carthaginians, as you know later, was composed of mostly like foreign mercenaries. They hired a lot from different regions of North Africa and Europe. And so you can see that their empire was mostly made up of different peoples: Iberians, Balearics, Celtic type Gauls, Sicilians, Italians, Greeks, Numidians, Libyans. So there was all kinds of people that were, within the Carthaginian state. Probably the Berbers are kind of in there too, like Berber type people are kind of in there, in North Africa. You can see Numidia and Libya. Those are two main areas that were kind of considered part of the Carthaginian state at one point. But Carthage was really more known for its navy, merchant marine type fleet, which they were able to kind of control a lot of the trade networks throughout the Mediterranean Sea, especially in the Western Mediterranean, controlling like parts of North Africa, Spain, Sicily, Sardinia, Corsica. And I think there's even some theories that the Carthaginians, sailed into the Atlantic Ocean as far north as England. I think there's even a theory that the Carthaginians may have sailed to America. I think there's another theory I've heard that they may have sailed down to where the tip of Africa is. So interesting stories about the Carthaginians, but like the Phoenicians, they were great sailors, as well. But why they call it Punic Wars, which is, the name that's often they call, the actual wars they fight against Carthage. Well, the term Punic is a Roman word that evolved from Latin or Greek. The Latin is Punicus, and the Greek is Punici, and the word means Phoenician. And so basically the term Punic Wars means the Phoenician Wars. So that's the translation of what the name means and why, of course, they call it that. So, and of course, as you know, the Romans, won this war. And so a lot of the history of the wars are basically told by the Romans, because the Romans later, destroy Carthage. They wipe them out, from the face of the earth, including their city. Carthage was, destroyed. I'll kind of talk about some of the different historians that write about Carthage, but here's kind of a picture showing you the actual city, what they think Carthage looked like. So it was this large-sized city. They think had 2 harbors to it, one for its navy and one for its merchant fleet. I think it had some kind of hippodrome-type racetrack that may have been there as well. But that's kind of a map of maybe what it looked like. But later, the Romans destroyed it, and they built like a newer version of Carthage, which is there later. Now, let me talk about some of the writers that write about Carthage. There's several that are famous. The one that's the most famous of the different Roman writers that wrote about the wars was Livy. Livy, known as Titus Livius, in his so-called History of Rome, has a series of books that are called The War of Hannibal. Now, that is considered one of the most famous of the books, which mostly cover the Second War, so-called Second Punic War, or some historians call it the Hannibalic War, where they fight Hannibal Barca, the famous Carthaginian general. And then Polybius, who's actually a Greek writer, has a series of books that were called the Histories of Polybius. That's considered the oldest, that was written right after the wars. And so they think that one's the most accurate that was written, and goes into, I think, the majority of the wars. And he covers also the Third Punic War, where the Romans sacked Carthage and all that. Appian is writing more into the Roman Empire in the 2nd century, like close to the 5 Good Emperors period. And he had a series of books that were called Roman History or Historia Romana. And it's not as well known, but it also covers a lot into the Punic Wars as well. So those are all the different authors that write about Rome in general. But like I said, to the victor go the spoils. And of course, most of the history of the wars are written from a Roman perspective in general. Now, I want to talk for a few minutes before I go today about the so-called Second Punic War. I'll get into that mostly, but they do have the First Punic War that they have first. I guess I'll mention that first a little bit about that one. That one's not as famous as the second one, but the First Punic War was from 264 to 241. This was a war where Sicily became the major conflict that caused the Punic Wars to break out. This was the longest conflict in the Punic Wars. Punic Wars, by the way, were some of the bloodiest conflicts in human history up to this point. I think close to maybe 1 to 2 million people were killed in these wars. And Rome wanted to take over Sicily, to use that to springboard to take over Africa. They say the Carthaginians wanted to control Sicily so they can invade Italy. So you have both deals where both want to, control parts of the Mediterranean Sea. And part of why the Romans were successful in the First War was because the Romans were able to develop a naval power, which they did not have before the war. Carthage was the naval power in the Western Mediterranean Sea. And so a lot of their conflicts were naval battles. They fought some on the island of Sicily, and they also fought North Africa as well in Carthage. And the Romans actually invented this boarding device, according to Polybius, which was called a corvus, and it was used to basically seize enemy ships in battle, like using infantry. It was like a boarding plank, basically, and they think it kind of played a major role in some of the naval battles of why Rome became a naval power. And from there, they were able to eventually win the war because they broke the back of Carthaginian power by the end of the war. Following the war, what happened was the Romans end up seizing control of Sicily, but they also take control of Corsica and Sardinia as well, west of Italy. So those become some of the first real conquests that the Romans have, of course, outside Italy, the peninsula. Now, between the wars, what happened, the most famous war, of course, that happened was the Second Punic War. This was a conflict, of course, that occurred because of Hamilcar Barca. I didn't really talk much about him, but Hamilcar Barca was a famous Carthaginian general in the First War. He was also the father of Hannibal Barca. He was the main general that fought Rome, the Second Punic War. And between the wars, between the First and Second Punic Wars, Hamilcar Barca went into Spain and began colonizing, adding it to the Carthaginian state. And Spain was called different names. Some people called it Iberia. Some people call it Hispania, which is where you get the word Hispanic from today. And then the Carthaginians called it New Carthage or something like that. Was one of the other names they called it. The Barcids, by the way, were a family of Carthaginian nobility who were famous generals. And so Hamilcar and his sons were all generals that fought a lot of these Punic Wars. Hannibal, Hasdrubal, Mago, they were all basically part of the so-called Barcid family. Some say Barcid. I think it's Barcid, how they say it. Of course, the one that is the most famous that everybody's heard about, of course, is Hannibal. Hannibal, as you know, was considered one of the greatest generals that fought in the Punic Wars. He was, of course, known as a military genius. A lot of historians today kind of see Hannibal as the so-called father of military strategy. He influenced a lot of other generals later in history. And he's often been compared to a lot of other generals. He's been compared to Alexander the Great. He's been compared to Scipio Africanus, who was a Roman general. He's been compared to Julius Caesar, Napoleon, etc. And so Hannibal was this, general that, heavily influenced a lot of military strategy. And before Hannibal, most battles were just hit them up the middle. Like you're playing football, you just run up the middle. And his idea was to attack the enemy on multiple fronts. So left flank, right flank, attack them in the rear, things like that. And these were ideas that really a lot of generals didn't really do before that. Maybe Alexander the Great did a little bit, but it was often not done that much. The Romans, by the way, feared Hannibal. There was a famous quote they used to say about Hannibal, which is, "Hannibal is at the gates." And oftentimes it was actually a saying that sometimes parents or nursemaids would tell children, like if they didn't want to go to bed or something, they would say, "Hannibal's at the gates. Hannibal's going to get you." And so Hannibal was this boogeyman, that was under the bed or in your closet. And even when Hannibal was dead, people still feared Hannibal, or there might be another Hannibal that might replace him, and things like that. Hannibal was the closest really that destroyed Rome, at least during the Republican period. Now I'm going to talk about, of course, what Hannibal is known for. If you look at this map here, of course, Hannibal eventually will invade the Roman Republican state. And what happened to really spark the so-called Second Punic War is there was a conflict over Spain, like who should control Spain, which the Romans had, their eyes on controlling Hispania as well. And then the Carthaginians wanted control of it as well. So that's really the main thing that would, cause the whole Second Punic War to, blow up, which I told you, Punic Wars were pretty bloody. It was definitely one of the bloodiest of the three Punic Wars, but 1 to 2 million is the combination of all casualties in all three wars combined, which I think was the bloodiest conflicts in history so far as I know. What caused it to break out was that Hannibal sacked the city on the eastern coast of Spain today, which is called Saguntum. Saguntum was actually this Greek city that had been found years ago by the ancient Greeks, but it was actually allied with the Romans. And so in 218, what happened was Hannibal laid siege to it and sacked it. And so it caused the Romans to declare war on Hannibal and Carthage. And so that's how the war broke out. Now, of course, the Romans thought that Hannibal was just going to, sit there. They're going to go invade Spain and all that. But that's not what Hannibal decided to do. What Hannibal decided to do, if you know about this, was he invaded Italy. He went on the offensive with a huge army. I think the army may have been actually closer to 100,000 in size. That might be exaggerated about that. But he invaded Italy by going through the Alps. That's one of the most famous things that Hannibal is well known for crossing the Alps, especially in the dead of winter in 218 BC. And if you know about Hannibal, he was famous for not just bringing infantry and cavalry, but he also brought elephants. If you know about the Carthaginians, they were notorious for fighting with war elephants. And so his forces swept down into northern Italy, surprising the Romans at that point. And the Romans did not have an answer for Hannibal. They got crushed in multiple battles. 218, Battle of Trebia, 217, the Battle of Lake Trasimene. The Roman forces were destroyed. They were put up against Hannibal in northern Italy. They didn't really know how to fight tactics against Hannibal because Romans weren't used to that kind of fighting. And so there was a Roman consul that basically said that we shouldn't really fight Hannibal mano to mano. Not a good idea. His tactics are too good. And so this man named Fabius Maximus, who was ridiculed later as being called the delayer, said we ought to use guerrilla tactics or even delaying tactics, maybe try to hit and run tactics on Hannibal, but not direct attack on Hannibal's forces, one-on-one. Well, a lot of Romans wouldn't listen. to Fabius. They thought he was a coward. They called him the delayer. And so he was sacked as Roman consul. And they brought in some other consuls that would, of course, replace him. And what the Romans decided to do in 216 BC was they decided to gamble with a huge army, which I believe had 16 legions in it, which was, I think, like 90,000 troops, something like that was the size of it. And they decided to attack Hannibal in southern Italy. If you go to this map here, Hannibal had brought his forces down to the bottom of Italy and marched all the way down to the Adriatic Sea here at a village called Cannae, which is right here. And this will be a very famous battle, a very pivotal battle, of course, in the Second Punic Wars. It is, of course, considered to be one of Hannibal's greatest military battles. He ever fought in, considered one of his greatest tactical victories against the Romans. And Hannibal's actually outnumbered 2-1 in the battle. That's one of the most amazing things about the battle. And he's going to rout that force. And I'll talk about, of course, later in the week on Wednesday about what Hannibal does afterwards. But the Romans will have to change their tactics. They obviously, when they do get routed at Cannae, the Romans are going to have to come up with different strategies to try and beat Carthage in general. So I'll talk about that, of course, later in the week. Also, we'll talk about the rise also of Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar, of course, one of those famous figures, in Roman history that they think helps to kind of end the Republic, because eventually the Roman Republic is going to become more of an empire, and you'll see the rise, of course, the Roman emperors later following that. So that's it for today's lecture, pretty much part one. Like I said, later in the week, I'll have part two lecture, of course, coming up on the Romans. I'll have future announcements upcoming about that. So if you have any comments, questions about the lecture, I don't think there's any comments right now, as far as I know. Please let me know later. You can always send me comments, questions, of course, about whichever lecture. If you have a question about the class, you can, of course, email me about that. If you want to subscribe to my channel, you can also do that. There should be a subscribe button on the bottom right. But that's it for today. Don't forget, I told you have two major assignments I know due right now this week. Of course, you've got the second exam. Oh, actually, I'm sorry. The Canvas quiz on India, I know is due Wednesday. The vocab, of course, second vocab due Friday. And then I think the second exam is not due till Monday, October 4th. So y'all do have like a week on that left to get that out the way. But do work on ancient India. That's the one thing you'll need to get out the way so you can work on the other stuff right now. So that's it. I'll talk, of course, later. Of course, part two lecture coming up on Rome. But I'll see you, of course, later in the week. So y'all take care and have a great week.